My name is Mary Collins. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been someone people describe as easy to overlook. Not because I lack presence, but because I never demanded it. I've spent years in supportive roles, both professionally and within my family. The kind of roles where things run smoothly because you're there, but no one quite notices how much effort that takes. People often assume I'm agreeable, that I don't mind, that I'm flexible, resilient, unaffected. They think my calm means I don't feel things deeply, or that I don't register what's being said when comments are delivered with a smile. I've learned that when you don't interrupt, people assume you're not keeping score. This story isn't about a dramatic turning point or a sudden act of defiance. It's about a long silence, and the moment that silence stopped being something I endured and became something I chose to end. They told me I'd be alone forever at my brother's engagement party. Then I refused to stay silent. It sounds sharp, maybe even confrontational. But what actually happened was much quieter than that. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no desire to hurt anyone back. What happened instead was a shift in understanding. For years, I was cast in a familiar role: the dependable sister, the emotionally steady one, the person who could take a joke. I was the one expected to be happy for everyone else, even when the celebration came with subtle reminders of what I supposedly lacked. And I accepted that role for a long time, because it seemed easier than questioning it. This story follows the emotional journey of realizing that being underestimated doesn't mean you are powerless. It traces the accumulation of small moments that were easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore together. And it leads to a decision that didn't change the room, but changed me. I'm sharing this not to rewrite the past and not to expose anyone. I'm sharing it because there's a difference between being peaceful and being silent out of fear. And because sometimes words lose power when they're finally answered, not with anger, but with clarity. This is a story about emotional justice, not revenge, about quiet dominance, not confrontation, about what happens when you stop explaining yourself and start standing still in your truth. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, no obligation to answer, even to yourself. Have you ever been underestimated so consistently that people stopped asking who you really were? To the people around me, I was predictable, dependable, the one who showed up early and stayed late, the one who remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward moments, and filled silences when they became uncomfortable. I wasn't the center of attention, and no one expected me to be. In many ways, that was the comfort of my role. In my family, I was the strong one. Not strong in a heroic sense, strong in the way furniture is strong, reliable, quiet, expected to carry weight without complaint. My brother was the bright star, the one whose milestones were celebrated loudly and publicly. I was the supporting structure, necessary but rarely acknowledged. At gatherings, people spoke around me more than to me. Conversations flowed past as if I were part of the furniture, present, useful, not essential to engage. If I offered an opinion, it was often met with polite nods and quick subject changes, not hostility, just disinterested, the kind that's harder to challenge because it wears the mask of normalcy. Professionally, it was similar. I was trusted with responsibility, but rarely with credit. I handled logistics, solved problems before they escalated, and absorbed stress so others didn't have to. People relied on me precisely because I didn't ask to be seen. My calm made their lives easier. My invisibility made their confidence louder. I told myself I preferred it this way, that I valued peace over recognition, that being underestimated protected me from pressure. And sometimes that was true. But over time, I realized something else was happening beneath the surface. When people underestimate you long enough, they stop imagining you could change. They speak freely in front of you. They make assumptions about your future. They joke about your present. And because you don't interrupt, they believe their version of you is accurate. In my family, I was the only sister, the one whose life was treated as a waiting room. People spoke about my time as if it were empty space, something to be filled eventually, if I were lucky. Comments were framed as concern, advice, or humor. You'll find someone someday. You're just too picky. At least you're independent. Each sentence delivered lightly, none intended to wound. But intention doesn't erase impact. What hurt wasn't any single remark. It was the pattern, the quiet agreement among others about who I was allowed to be. No one asked if I was content. No one asked what I wanted. They assumed absence of evidence was evidence of absence of desire, of depth, of ambition. And I let them. Not because I agreed, but because correcting them felt exhausting. Because pushing back would have disrupted the calm that everyone relied on me to maintain. So I learned to smile, to redirect, to make myself smaller without disappearing entirely. I became very good at being agreeable without being honest. Looking back, I can see how skillfully I disappeared in plain sight. I was present at every major moment, birthdays, holidays, engagements, yet somehow absent from the narrative. My role was fixed, the dependable sister, the safe one, the one who wouldn't cause discomfort by wanting more. And I didn't challenge that image, not at first. Because when you've been cast in a role for long enough, you start performing it automatically, even when no one is watching. I thought silence was maturity. I thought restraint was dignity. I thought that if something truly mattered, it would eventually be noticed without my having to name it. That belief kept me quiet longer than it should have. But silence doesn't always signal peace. Sometimes it signals resignation. And that was who I was to them then. The woman who would always understand, always adapt, always be fine. The one whose life was discussed, not witnessed. The one whose presence was expected, but whose voice was optional. That version of me felt familiar to everyone else. It just didn't feel true anymore. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel dramatic at the time. That's the strange thing about it. If you had asked me that day whether anything was wrong, I would have said no without hesitation. I would have meant it too, because the moment itself was small, almost forgettable. It happened months before my brother's engagement party, at a casual family dinner. Nothing formal, just takeout containers on the table, people talking over one another, the familiar rhythm of voices I'd known my entire life. I was listening more than speaking as usual. When someone asked my brother about his relationship, there was warmth in the room when he talked about his girlfriend's plans, jokes, and shared memories. People leaned in. They were invested. At some point, someone turned to me and smiled, almost kindly, and said something like, "Well, Mary doesn't need that kind of complication. She's happy on her own." It wasn't said with cruelty. That's important. It was said as a statement of fact, as if my inner life had already been reviewed and summarized, a neat conclusion delivered on my behalf. A few people nodded. Someone laughed softly. The conversation moved on. I smiled too. I didn't correct them. I didn't say yes or no. I let the moment pass like a car you decide not to chase because you assume another one will come along. But something about it stayed with me. Not the words themselves, but the ease with which they were accepted. No one asked if that was true. No one checked my expression for confirmation. It wasn't a question, it was a definition. And definitions, once spoken aloud, have a way of settling into the air like dust. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment. Not angrily, curiously. I asked myself why it had bothered me. After all, I was capable on my own. I did value independence. There was nothing insulting on the surface. And yet, the comment had erased something important. It had turned my choices into a consolation prize. It framed my life as something that had happened to me, not something I was actively shaping. I realized then that people weren't just underestimating me, they were narrating me. That was the first small cut. The realization that my silence wasn't being read as depth or discretion. It was being read as confirmation. Each time I didn't correct an assumption, it hardened into truth for someone else. What made it sharper was how invisible it was to everyone but me. No one else remembered the comment. No one else felt its weight. If I had brought it up, I would have sounded sensitive, defensive, dramatic. So I said nothing. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was the cost of being private in a world that rewards performance. I rationalized my quiet the way I always had, by calling it maturity. But a thought had lodged itself in my mind, and it didn't leave. If this is who they think I am when I say nothing, who do they think I'm not? From that moment on, I began to notice things I'd previously let slide. Comments framed as reassurance that subtly lowered expectations. compliments that praised my adaptability rather than my agency. The way people spoke about my future was as if it were a gentle, unknown, empty, but peaceful. None of it was aggressive. That was the problem. It was all reasonable enough to excuse, easy enough to ignore. But together, it formed a quiet message. You don't require consideration. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't correct the record. Outwardly, nothing changed. I continued to show up, to listen, to smile at the right moments. But internally, something had shifted. For the first time, I wondered whether my silence was actually protecting me, or whether it was protecting everyone else from having to update their assumptions. That question stayed with me. It didn't demand action yet, it just waited. And sometimes that's how change begins. Not with a decision, but with discomfort you can no longer explain away. Once you notice a pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. What surprised me wasn't how suddenly the dismissals appeared, but how long they'd already been there, quiet, consistent, disguised as normal interaction. After that dinner, I started catching moments in real time, not with anger, but with a strange clarity, like adjusting the focus on a lens I'd been looking through my whole life. At work, it showed up in meetings where decisions were made before I arrived, even though I was responsible for implementing them. People would say, "We figured you'd be fine with this," as if my consent were automatic. If I raised a concern, it was met with reassurance rather than discussion. "Don't worry, Mary, you always make it work." Always. That word followed me everywhere. In my family, the language was softer, but no less defining. Plans were made around my availability, not my preferences. I was expected to be flexible because I didn't have complications. My time was treated as open space, borrowable, adjustable, endlessly elastic. If I hesitated even briefly, there was confusion, not anger, confusion, as if I'd stepped out of character. I learned to smooth that over quickly. I'd say yes, even when I meant maybe. I'd downplay my own fatigue so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. And when comments crossed a line, I reframed them for myself. They didn't mean it that way. They're just trying to help. This is easier than explaining. That last one became my favorite justification. What I didn't realize at the time was that every rationalization taught people something about me. It taught them that I would absorb impact without reflecting it back, that I would translate their carelessness into kindness on their behalf. And once people learn that about you, they stop being careful. The jokes became more pointed, still polite, still laughable, but now they landed with a familiar certainty. You're so self-sufficient, you don't need anyone. You're lucky. You don't have to compromise. Each sentence wrapped in praise, each one quietly closing a door. I nodded. I smiled. I agreed just enough to keep the peace. On the outside, I looked calm. On the inside, I was negotiating with myself constantly. Is this worth addressing? Am I being unfair? Would speaking up even change anything? Silence became the default, not because I didn't have words, but because I was tired of defending my right to use them. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being reasonable all the time, from meeting everyone else halfway while standing still yourself. You start to believe that asking for clarity is selfish, that discomfort is your responsibility to manage. So I normalized it. I told myself this was just how families worked, how workplaces functioned. Someone had to be the adaptable one. Someone had to be low friction. And since I was good at it, it might as well be me. But normalization has a cost. It blurs the line between patience and erasure, between kindness and compliance. The more I accepted the role, the more fixed it became. People stopped checking in altogether. They didn't ask what I thought, they assumed. And when you live long enough inside other people's assumptions, you begin to disappear from your own decisions. I wasn't angry yet, that came later. At this stage, I was mostly tired of translating myself into something easier for others to digest, tired of being praised for traits that kept me small. And still, I stayed quiet, because speaking up felt like it would require more energy than I had, because I wasn't ready to disrupt the balance, because deep down I believed that if I just kept being steady, eventually someone would notice the weight I was carrying. That belief kept me compliant longer than any fear ever could. But compliance doesn't earn respect. It only teaches people what they can get away with. And without realizing it, I was teaching that lesson every day. There's a moment when you stop wondering why something keeps happening and start recognizing what it is. For me, that moment came quietly, without confrontation or revelation, just a steady understanding settling in. I had been assigned a role, not formally, not maliciously, but clearly. I was the reliable one, the emotional buffer, the person who would adapt so others didn't have to. In my family, that meant being the one who handled logistics, who anticipated needs, who absorbed awkwardness so no one else felt it. In professional spaces, it meant being the one who executed plans without being invited into their creation. I wasn't excluded, I was included selectively, invited for output, not for input. Once I saw it, everything made sense. The reason people were comfortable making decisions for me was that my life was discussed as if it were hypothetical. The reason no one worried about crossing a line, they assumed I'd redraw it somewhere more convenient. Roles like mine are rewarded quietly. You're praised for being easy, flexible, and understanding. You become indispensable without being influential. And the longer you perform that role well, the harder it is to step out of it without causing confusion. Because people don't see roles as choices, they see them as identities. I realized that no one was intentionally minimizing me. They were interacting with a version of me I had helped create. Every time I chose peace over clarity, I reinforced the expectation that I would continue to do so. That realization was uncomfortable. It meant I couldn't place all the responsibility outside myself. I had participated in my own invisibility, not because I lacked self-respect, but because I had been taught that asserting myself would cost more than it gave. The role came with unspoken rules. I wasn't supposed to need reassurance. I wasn't supposed to require space. I wasn't supposed to complicate the narrative. When my brother's engagement was announced, those rules tightened without anyone saying a word. Excitement filled the room. Plans began immediately. Conversations revolved around the future, venues, guest lists, timelines. Everyone had a place in the story. Except me. I was expected to be supportive, enthusiastic, available. My feelings about the announcement were assumed to be uncomplicated. Happiness for him was enough. My own life didn't need to be factored in. And I played the part perfectly. I smiled. I offered help. I made myself useful. I didn't mention the small tightening in my chest when people spoke about the next stage of life, as if it were a universal path I had somehow missed. What struck me most was not what was said, but what wasn't. No one asked how I was doing, not because they didn't care, but because my role didn't require checking. I was the stable one, the one who would be fine. That's the danger of being competent and quiet. People assume you don't need consideration. They forget that strength isn't immunity. By the time the engagement party approached, my place was clearly defined. I was part of the event, but not the focus. A supporting character in someone else's milestone. And I understood that this was how they saw me. What I hadn't understood yet was how close I was to no longer accepting it. At this point, I still believed I could carry the role without losing myself, that I could remain kind without becoming invisible. That balance, I thought, was just a matter of patience. I didn't know yet that patience, when unreciprocated, turns into permission. And permission, once granted, is rarely returned without consequence. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point, no raised voice, no dramatic exit. In fact, if you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, weeks before the engagement party. I was sitting alone in my apartment, sorting through paperwork I'd been postponing. Bank statements, old folders, documents I'd kept out of habit more than intention. It was the kind of task you do on autopilot, your mind drifting while your hands move. And then I came across something that stopped me. It wasn't shocking, it wasn't scandalous, it was simply clarifying. As I reviewed the details of my own life, my finances, my long-term planning, the quiet structures I'd built without fanfare, I realized something that felt both grounding and unsettling. I was far more established than anyone gave me credit for. Not just stable, intentional. I had made deliberate choices. I had declined certain paths not because I couldn't take them, but because they didn't align with what I wanted. I had invested time, money, and energy into building a life that worked for me, even if it didn't look impressive from the outside. And suddenly, the way people spoke about me felt disconnected from reality. The version of Mary they discussed, the one who was waiting, lacking, incomplete, didn't match the facts on my table. It was a story that had been told so often that it had replaced observation. That realization landed quietly, but it changed the way I held myself. For the first time, I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel the urge to correct anyone. I felt detached, as if I had stepped back and was observing a misunderstanding that no longer required my emotional involvement. I saw then that my silence had been interpreted as agreement, but agreement was no longer necessary. I didn't need to be understood to be secure. That afternoon, I made a decision. Not an action, just a decision. I stopped mentally preparing explanations I was never asked to give. I stopped rehearsing responses to comments that hadn't yet been made. I stopped shrinking my internal world to fit someone else's assumptions. Nothing external changed that day. I still answered messages. I still showed up when expected. I still played my role. But internally, something had reoriented. Silence was no longer something happening to me. It became something I was choosing, with intention. I began to notice how much energy I had been spending managing other people's comfort. How often I adjusted my tone, my timing, my honesty to avoid disruption. That energy, once reclaimed, felt powerful in its simplicity. I didn't confront anyone because I didn't need to. I wasn't angry. I was clear. The shift wasn't about deciding to speak louder. It was about deciding to listen to myself. From that point on, every interaction felt slightly different. Not because others changed, but because I had. Their words still arrived, but they didn't land the same way. I no longer absorbed them as truth. I registered them as information. And information, once detached from emotion, becomes leverage. I didn't know yet how or when that leverage would matter. I only knew that something irreversible had begun. A line had been drawn, not in conversation, but in consciousness. The engagement party was still ahead of me. The comments, the expectations, the familiar patterns. I could see them forming already. But now I was watching from a different place, and that made all the difference. Once the internal shift had happened, silence changed its texture. It was no longer heavy or defensive. It became light, deliberate, almost strategic. I still didn't explain myself. I still didn't correct assumptions in real time. But now I wasn't doing it because I felt obligated or afraid of disrupting harmony. I was doing it because I was observing. There's a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you're gathering information. I had crossed that line without announcing it. In conversations, I listened more carefully than ever. Not just to what people said, but to what they assumed. I noticed how often my preferences were filled in for me, how confidently people spoke about my future without inviting me into the discussion, and how comfortable they were doing so in my presence. What surprised me was how little resistance there was when I withdrew my emotional labor. I stopped smoothing transitions. I stopped filling silences. I answered questions directly, without softening or elaboration. Not coldly, just clearly. And because I didn't make a show of it, no one challenged the change. They simply adjusted around it, assuming I was tired or distracted. That assumption worked in my favor. People often mistake calm restraint for passivity. They assume that if you're not reacting, you're not registering. That misconception gave me space to see how deeply the role had been ingrained, not just in others, but in the systems I moved through. I began to notice patterns. Who benefited from my flexibility? Who relied on my availability? I felt unsettled when I didn't immediately accommodate. None of it required confrontation. It required attention. And attention, I learned, is a form of power. At work, I quietly documented processes I had been managing alone. I clarified boundaries without announcing them. If something wasn't my responsibility, I didn't rush to claim it. I let small gaps appear, not enough to cause chaos, just enough to reveal dependency. At home, I stopped preemptively explaining my schedule. I declined invitations without apology, not dramatically, just plainly. And when asked why, I answered honestly, without cushioning. I already have plans. No further justification. People noticed, but they didn't push, not yet. Silence, when chosen, has a way of unsettling those who are used to your predictability. They can't tell if something is wrong because you haven't signaled distress. They just sense that something has shifted, and that makes them uneasy. The engagement party loomed closer. Family group chats filled with logistics and expectations. My role was implied, never discussed. Help would be needed. Flexibility would be assumed. And for the first time, I didn't rush to volunteer. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't. What happened was instructive. Others stepped in. Not seamlessly, not gracefully, but they did. The world didn't collapse without my invisible support, and that realization was sobering. I saw then that much of what I had been carrying wasn't essential. It was just convenient for everyone else. That knowledge didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. Silence had become my filter. I spoke when it mattered. I withheld when it didn't. And every choice was intentional. They still thought they knew me. They still believed I would adapt, that I would understand, that I would be fine. They didn't realize that silence, once reclaimed, isn't emptiness, it's positioning. While everything looked the same on the surface, a different kind of work had begun underneath. Quiet, methodical, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. And no one was paying attention. That was the advantage. People who believe that they understand you stop observing you closely. They think the story is finished. They assume no new information is coming. That assumption gave me freedom. I began preparing, not for confrontation, but for independence of outcome. I reviewed my finances carefully. Not because anything was wrong, but because clarity is a form of stability. I consolidated accounts, updated records, and made sure every decision I had made over the years was properly documented and accessible. It wasn't dramatic, it was responsible. And it reminded me how much of my life I had already built without approval. I organized paperwork that had been scattered across drawers and folders. Insurance, beneficiaries, contingencies, things people often delay because they assume there will be time later. I didn't feel urgency. I felt readiness. At work, I did something similar. I mapped out the systems I had been holding together quietly for years. I noted where my input was critical, where it was simply habitual, and where it was unnecessary. I didn't announce any of this. I just learned. Knowledge accumulates power not by being shared, but by being held correctly. I also paid attention to language. Who framed my availability as a given? Who spoke for me rather than to me? I grew uncomfortable when I didn't immediately respond. These weren't grievances. They were data points. I noticed how often people confused kindness with compliance, how they filled my silence with their own narratives, and how rarely anyone checked whether those narratives were still accurate. The closer the engagement party came, the more clearly I could see the shape of the moment ahead. I didn't know exactly what would be said, but I knew the tone: light, public, framed as humor or concern, safe enough that no one would expect resistance. That predictability was important. I didn't rehearse responses, I didn't plan a speech, I didn't imagine vindication. I simply made sure that whatever happened, I wouldn't be reacting from a place of uncertainty. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like removing your own dependence on outcomes. I also made one small personal adjustment that no one noticed. I stopped seeking emotional validation from spaces that had never offered it consistently. I redirected that energy inward and outward, selectively, toward friendships that didn't require translation, toward interests that didn't need justification. That shift alone changed my posture. By the time the party arrived, I wasn't hoping for respect. I wasn't bracing for an insult. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was complete regardless. They never noticed the preparations because they weren't looking for change. They were looking for continuity, for me to show up as expected, say the right things, and absorb the familiar jokes. And in a way, I did show up as expected, just not in the way they thought. Because while they were focused on celebrating a future they understood, I was standing calmly inside a present they had never bothered to learn. The reveal wasn't a discovery in the traditional sense. There was no secret uncovered, no hidden betrayal, no dramatic truth exposed. What I found was quieter than that, and far more destabilizing. It happened when I finally allowed myself to look at my life without translating it for anyone else. I sat with the facts, not the narrative, not the assumptions, just the evidence. I had financial independence, not theoretical, real. I had professional leverage, even if it wasn't visible in titles or applause. I had relationships built on mutual respect, not obligation. I had options, more than I'd ever admitted to myself. And suddenly I understood the real imbalance. The power dynamic had never been about my supposed lack. It had been about their comfort. My silence had made it easier for others to feel secure in their own choices. My adaptability had smoothed over their doubts. My willingness to be fine had allowed them to avoid questioning whether their comments, their expectations, their jokes were fair. The leverage I discovered wasn't something new I had gained. It was something I had always had, but never needed to use. I realized that nothing about my life required approval from the people who spoke most confidently about it. Their opinions didn't fund me, their assumptions didn't sustain me, their expectations didn't define my future. That clarity stripped their words of weight. For the first time, I understood why I had never truly felt the urge to defend myself. Defense implies vulnerability. What I felt now was stability. The engagement party was approaching fast. I could picture the room already. The warmth, the toasts, the casual remarks framed as humor. I knew there would be a moment. Not because I was hoping for one, but because patterns repeat when uninterrupted. And in that moment, I would have a choice. Not whether to explode or stay quiet, but whether to remain invisible or to be precise. The private reveal wasn't about preparing to speak. It was about knowing that if I did, I wouldn't be asking for space. I would be taking it. There was no satisfaction in this realization. No rush, just calm. The kind that comes when you understand that the ground under your feet is solid, regardless of who's standing with you. I didn't rehearse what I might say. I didn't need to. Because leverage doesn't require performance. It requires certainty. And for the first time, I had it. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic crossroads. There was no internal debate raging late into the night. No list of pros and cons scribbled on paper. By the time I reached the moment of choice, most of the deciding had already been done. What remained was commitment. The engagement party was the setting, but it wasn't the reason. The reason was simpler. I could no longer allow other people's assumptions to stand unchallenged, not because they hurt me, but because they limited me. There were several options available to me. I could maintain silence and let the familiar narrative continue. I could correct the record gently, privately, afterward. I could deflect with humor and keep the peace. All of those paths were open, and all of them would have preserved comfort for everyone but me. The irreversible option was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't involve exposing anyone or embarrassing them. It simply involved refusing to participate in my own minimization. I decided that if a moment arose where my life was summarized incorrectly, especially in public, I would respond. Not emotionally, not defensively, just accurately. That was the line I drew. The risk wasn't conflict. The risk was disruption. People don't like it when a story that they've been telling themselves is corrected mid-sentence, especially when they believed it was harmless. But I also understood something else. If I didn't speak then, I never would. Not because I couldn't, but because the longer silence continues, the harder it becomes to interrupt without sounding reactive. This wasn't about reclaiming dignity in one evening. It was about ending a pattern. I didn't expect applause. I didn't expect understanding. I expected discomfort. And I accepted it. That acceptance was the point of no return. When you decide that your truth doesn't need to be palatable to be valid, something shifts permanently. You stop managing reactions. You stop negotiating tone. You trust your own steadiness. I arrived at the party calm, observant, unguarded. I greeted people warmly. I congratulated my brother sincerely. Nothing about my demeanor suggested a turning point. And that's why the decision held, because it wasn't fueled by emotion. It was anchored in clarity. The moment it came, it would feel ordinary to everyone else. A passing comment, a familiar joke, the kind of thing that had always slid by unnoticed. But this time I wouldn't slide with it. Not to make a point. Just to tell the truth. And once truth is spoken without apology, it can't be taken back. What happened next didn't announce itself. There were no visible shifts, no sudden reactions, no immediate consequences. From the outside, everything appeared unchanged. That was intentional. Because before anything is felt, it is set in motion. In the weeks surrounding the engagement party, I moved quietly. Not in opposition to anyone, but in alignment with myself. I stopped offering availability by default. I didn't explain changes unless asked. And when I was asked, I answered simply. No emotional framing, no apologies disguised as politeness. At work, I formalized boundaries that had previously been informal. Responsibilities that had lived only in my head were documented and clarified. I delegated where I could, stepped back where I had been overextended, and allowed others to experience the full weight of what I had been carrying alone. No one objected. They barely noticed. That's the thing about invisible labor. Its absence is often felt before its presence is acknowledged. Financially, I finalized decisions I had been considering for months. Long-term plans were confirmed. Contingencies were secured. I removed ambiguity wherever it existed. Not because I anticipated fallout, but because certainty is a form of insulation. I also did something subtle but significant. I stopped preemptively reassuring people. When someone seemed uncertain about my choices, I didn't rush to soothe that discomfort. I let it exist, not to punish anyone, but because it wasn't mine to manage anymore. That shift unsettled some people, though they couldn't name why. Conversations lingered a beat longer. Questions were asked and then withdrawn. Familiar dynamics hesitated, like a step missing from a staircase. Still, no one confronted me. They couldn't, because nothing was wrong. I was still kind, still composed, still present. I simply wasn't compensating. And without that compensation, the imbalance began to surface. My brother and his fiancée were busy with plans, blissfully unaware of the quiet recalibration happening around them. I supported them sincerely, but on my terms. When I helped, it was because I chose to, not because it was assumed. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without needing validation. It means trusting that your internal alignment will eventually register externally, without forcing it. By the time the party arrived, the groundwork had been laid, not for confrontation, but for consequence, natural consequence. The kind that unfolds not because someone is punished, but because a pattern is no longer maintained. They still saw me as predictable. They had no idea I had already stepped out of the role they relied on. And when the shift finally became visible, it wouldn't be because I demanded recognition. It would be because my absence from the old pattern made itself felt. The first signs weren't dramatic. No one confronted me. No one accused me of changing. Instead, there was a subtle confusion that settled into the spaces I used to occupy so effortlessly. Things didn't flow as smoothly anymore. Messages went unanswered longer than expected. Not because I ignored them, but because I didn't anticipate them. Tasks that had once been handled quietly now required discussion. Decisions stalled where they once moved forward, without friction. People began to feel the absence of something they had never consciously acknowledged: me. At work, small inefficiencies surfaced. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to be noticed. Someone asked where a process document was. Another asked who usually handled a coordination step. For years, those answers had been assumed. Now, they had to be asked out loud. The tone wasn't accusatory, it was unsettled. At home, it was similar. Family conversations paused more often. Plans were revisited. Someone would say, "Mary usually knows," and then hesitate, realizing I hadn't stepped in. I didn't rush to fill the gap, not out of spite, out of respect for myself. What surprised me was how quickly discomfort appeared once my quiet support was no longer guaranteed. People weren't angry, they were disoriented. They had built systems, emotional and practical, around my consistency. When that consistency became conditional, they didn't know how to recalibrate. My brother noticed it first, though he didn't name it. He checked in more often, asked neutral questions that carried uncertainty beneath them. "Everything okay? You seem busy lately." I answered honestly, "I am," and left it there. That was enough to shift the balance. The engagement party itself came and went without incident. The moment I had anticipated, the familiar comment, the casual assumption, did happen. And when it did, I responded calmly, accurately, and without explanation. The room didn't react immediately, but something changed. After that night, the energy around me was different, not colder, more careful. People hesitated before speaking for me. Jokes softened. Assumptions were phrased as questions. They were beginning to realize that something they relied on had been withdrawn. Not maliciously, but permanently. Consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive as an effort. And for the first time, others were having to make some. Once people sense a shift they don't understand, their first instinct is to restore what felt familiar. Not by addressing the cause, but by recreating the conditions they benefited from. That's when the panic began, quietly. It showed up as sudden warmth, invitations phrased with extra care, compliments that felt a little delayed, a little rehearsed. People began checking in not because they had a new understanding, but because they were uncomfortable with uncertainty. They wanted the old equilibrium back. What they didn't realize was that the equilibrium had depended on my unspoken consent, and that consent had been withdrawn long before they noticed. My brother tried, in his own way. He invited me to coffee, spoke gently, and circled around the topic without touching it. He told me how much he appreciated me, how he always admired my strength, how I'd always been fine on my own. The words were familiar. Once they would have landed as reassurance. Now they sounded like evidence. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I simply said, "I know," and let the silence do the work. That silence unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Others attempted different approaches: humor, nostalgia, subtle guilt, reminders of how things used to be. None of it was malicious, but all of it was backward-looking. An attempt to negotiate with a version of me that no longer existed. What they wanted was reassurance that nothing had really changed. But something had. The shift wasn't behavioral, it was structural. I had stopped occupying a role that made their lives easier at my expense. And roles, once abandoned, can't be reclaimed on someone else's terms. They were too late to fix it because there was nothing to fix. Nothing was broken. The discomfort they felt wasn't damage, it was an adjustment. And adjustment requires effort, awareness, sometimes humility, things that can't be rushed or requested retroactively. I could see the realization forming slowly, unevenly, that my silence had not been accidental, that my boundaries were not a phase, that the version of me they had relied on was no longer available by default. Some people adapted, others didn't, but none of them could undo the moment I had chosen myself without explanation. That's the part no one tells you. When you stop negotiating your worth, people don't lose you. They lose access. And once access changes, there's no way back to innocence. Only forward. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no emotional release. It took place on a quiet afternoon, weeks after the engagement party, when the initial confusion had settled into something more focused. My brother asked if we could talk. We sat across from each other at a small table, the kind of setting where nothing dramatic ever happens. He looked uncomfortable, not defensive. That mattered. It told me this wasn't about blame. It was about recalibration. He started carefully. He said he felt like he had lost his footing with me, that I seemed further away, that he didn't know if he had done something wrong. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was withholding, but because I didn't need to rush the moment. When he finished, I said something simple. I didn't go anywhere. That stopped him. I explained calmly that I had spent years being easy to interpret because it made things smoother for everyone else. I didn't correct assumptions because it seemed unnecessary at the time. And that at some point, I realized those assumptions were being treated as facts. I didn't accuse. I didn't list examples. I didn't raise my voice. I said, I just stopped agreeing silently. There was a long pause, not an uncomfortable one, an honest one. He nodded slowly, not in full understanding, but in recognition. He admitted he had never questioned the narrative around me because it was convenient. Not malicious, just convenient. That was enough. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand change. I didn't need promises. I had already changed the only part I could control. The conversation ended quietly. No resolution, no dramatic closure. Just a shared awareness that something fundamental had shifted, and that it couldn't be unshifted. Confrontation doesn't always require force. Sometimes it only requires refusing to carry what was never yours to begin with. I'm not a different person now. That's the part people often misunderstand. I didn't become colder, harder, or less kind. I didn't trade empathy for distance. What changed wasn't my nature, it was my position. I no longer live slightly angled toward other people's expectations. Who I am now is someone who stands squarely in her own life. I still listen. I still care. I still show up when it matters. But I don't overextend to prove my value. And I don't soften my truth to make it easier to accept. I've learned that clarity is not cruelty, and restraint is not weakness. The role I once occupied, reliable, adaptable, invisible, no longer fits me. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. I had been performing only the parts of myself that caused the least friction. Now, I allow the rest to exist without explanation. People interact with me differently, more carefully, more directly. Some relationships grew quieter, others grew stronger. A few fell away entirely. None of that felt like loss. It felt like alignment. I no longer rush to correct misunderstandings unless they matter. I don't feel silence unless I choose to. I don't carry emotional weight that belongs to someone else. And when assumptions are made about me now, they're met not with discomfort, but with calm correction, or no correction at all. That's power people don't see coming. Because it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand attention, it doesn't need witnesses. It's the power of being internally settled. I understand now that being underestimated isn't an insult, it's information. It tells you how little people are actually paying attention. And once you know that, you stop trying to perform for their understanding. I don't feel bitterness toward the past version of myself. She did what she needed to do to survive and stay connected, but she was operating on borrowed definitions. I'm not anymore. Who I am now is someone who chooses when to speak, when to act, and when to remain still. Someone who understands that silence, when it's chosen, can be louder than explanation. And most importantly, someone who no longer waits to be seen in order to exist fully. There's a quiet myth we're taught early on that if we're patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, people will eventually see us clearly. That our intentions will translate on their own. That silence, if it's graceful, will be rewarded with respect. What I've learned is simpler and harder to accept. People don't respond to who you are. They respond to who you consistently allow yourself to be in their presence. For a long time, I allowed myself to be interpreted instead of expressed. I allowed assumptions to stand because challenging them felt disruptive. I believed that harmony was proof of maturity, even when it came at the cost of my own clarity. But harmony that depends on your self-erasure isn't peace. It's compliance wearing a polite face. This story was never about my brother's engagement party. That was just the moment when the pattern became visible. The real shift happened much earlier, when I realized that words lose power when they're finally answered. Not with volume, not with emotion, but with alignment. I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. I needed to stop negotiating it internally. That's the moral I carry forward now. You don't owe people access just because they're familiar. You don't owe silence just because speaking might make things uncomfortable. And you don't owe an explanation for a life that already stands on its own. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about no longer participating in stories that shrink you. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this, it's this. When you stop performing the version of yourself that keeps others comfortable, the right people don't leave, they adjust. And the ones who can't, they were never relating to you in the first place. Before we end, I want to leave you with a single question, one that doesn't require an answer right away, or even out loud. Where in your life have you been silent? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you were taught it was easier to stay understood than to be accurate. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Not explanations, not defenses, just truth. That's where real conversation begins.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.